Napoleon, like anyone can even know that.
Hi friends! Okay, so far in our series, we've basically done two things, right? We've learned how to create a very rudimentary Active Directory domain so we can practice our rate teaming. And then after this, we learned kind of the basics of metasploit, including how to get a shell on a target system. Okay, so that's great, everything's in place. At the same time, we haven't really done anything. And so the good news is, now that we've laid our foundation, for the rest of the course, we'll be doing stuff. And so today we'll start with a crucial step in our rate teaming endeavors, enumeration. So at the risk of really stating the obvious here, in any situation, there's a direct correlation between what you know about a situation and what you can do in a situation. i.e., there's a direct correlation with information and ability. And this is, of course, why information is valuable. It's useful. And so, of course, in terms of compromising a network, this is no different. When we get on a machine, we typically land blind, right? What I mean is, we know very little about the host machine we're on, and we probably know next to nothing about the network it's embedded within. And so in order for us to progress and ultimately achieve our goals, hopefully in as efficient and stealthy manner as possible, the first thing we'll typically want to do when we land on a machine is learn more about it and its environment. Now, broadly speaking, we can bifurcate enumeration into two subcategories: host enumeration and domain enumeration. So when we think of a network and what we'd like to know, we can typically break it down into these two categories. First, we want to learn more about the individual systems, the individual hosts, including the system we're currently on, as well as the other systems. This, not too surprisingly, is called host enumeration. At the same time, we also want to kind of zoom out and look at the network as a whole and look at its structure and layout, how it's configured, including, of course, Active Directory setup. This is called domain enumeration. So in this video, we'll only be focusing on domain enumeration, and in the next video, I'll cover host enumeration. Also, just so we're clear here, this video is obviously continuation in this series. So if you haven't yet, you would have needed to complete the first two videos in order to be able to follow along today. If you haven't done so, fret not. I'll put the little cards up right now. And as well, you can look at right at the top of the description. So if you haven't yet done it, take a moment, go complete those, and you can meet us back here. And so before we get going with that kind of actual practical application, I just want to spend a quick minute talking about domain enumeration, which is obviously our focus today. And so as I said before, domain enumeration really helps us to understand the broader network and organizational structure. Now, there are two broad ways in which we can enumerate. We can use the living off the lands approach, in which we use already built-in or existing commands and applications, for example, wmic, or we can use specialized scripts, for example, Powerview or Bloodhound. So for now, I just want you to be aware that these two different approaches exist. And later on in this video, I'll take a quick moment and I'll explain the differences between the two, as well as kind of the pros and cons why you would choose one or the other. But for now, methinks that's enough dilly-dallying, and so let's get to it. Okay friends, and so just so we orientate ourselves properly, I just wanted to show you I'm obviously in a VMware workstation. Here you can see a tab, which is my domain controller, so that's running. And then there is the workstation that's connected to that domain controller. This will serve as our kind of de facto victim in this scenario. And then over here is our Kali Linux machine where we'll be operating from mostly in this lesson. So I just wanted you to kind of be aware of what's happening in the background, but I'm going to make this full screen just so it's a little bit prettier for us. And then one other thing I want to mention before we actually get going is I obviously referred in the introduction to kind of the two broad pathways we can take for domain enumeration, that being a living off the lands approach or a specialized script approach. So we'll be starting with the specialized script approach. And so specifically with regards to our specialized script, today we'll be using something called Powerview, which is part of a great framework called Powersploit, written by a group of badasses known as the PowerShell Mafia. And so because we will be using Powerview that's written in PowerShell, the first thing we want to do before anything is we just want to load our PowerShell extension, which is going to allow us to execute PowerShell scripts directly in the context of this interpreter session. Right, so we're able to run PowerShell scripts now, but now there's two main things that we need to do before we can actually start executing Powerview functions. The first thing is we actually have to download Powerview from GitHub onto this Kali system. And then the second part is we have to upload it from the Kali system onto the victim system. So let's do that. So I'm going to hit Control Shift and T. That'll open up a new tab for us. And so the first thing I'll do is I'm just going to run a curl command. Obviously you could use wget if you wanted to, and we can see there that quite simply all that's happening here is I'm invoking curl. There's the output, so I'm going to save it to desktop, and then here we can see the URL from GitHub, PowerShell Mafia, Powersploit, that's the framework, and then the specific script we'll be using is powerview.ps1, ps1 of course being the extension for a PowerShell script. So let's run that. And we can see it completed successfully, so we can head on back to our Meterpreter session. Right, so now that we're inside of our Meterpreter session, the next thing we want to do is upload it onto the victim system. So it's pretty simple because we already have this kind of C2 connection established. We can use a built-in Meterpreter function, and it's simply called upload. And so I'm going to paste the command here. You can see upload, which is the name of the function. This is obviously the source, which is currently on our Kali Linux system on the desktop. And we're going to save it here in the temp very sneakily as kernel.ps1. And so one little quick thing I wanted to show here is just what's kind of weird are these backslashes. So most of you might be aware, but just the kind of like file structure of Linux systems, we use forward slashes, whereas with Windows we use backslashes. Now, why are we doing double backslashes? Well, I mentioned before in a previous video that metasploit is completely written in Ruby. And backslash has a specific meaning in Ruby. It specifically means end of line break. And because of that, we need to basically provide an escape character before it so that it understands that we don't mean line break, we mean literally backslash. And of course, the escape character also happens to be a backslash. Therefore, we're doing double backslash because de facto in Ruby, a double backslash means a single backslash, basically. So let's run that. And again, we can see that it was successful. Right, so right now we're in a Meterpreter shell. Perhaps before you've seen that you can write shell, and if I hit this, we'll basically drop into a command prompt shell. But we actually obviously want to be in a PowerShell shell. And so just write PowerShell_shell. And now we can see the PS here basically signifies that we're no longer in a Meterpreter shell, we're now in a PowerShell shell. And so the first thing we immediately want to do before we even get going on our Powerview script is we actually just want to make sure that we're allowed to execute scripts. We can actually assume that this system probably isn't set up to allow random willy-nilly scripts to just run. And so we're going to run this command, which is just temporarily going to change the execution policy on this current PowerShell session. It's going to allow scripts to run with no restrictions, right? There we can see unrestricted. And another thing we're doing here is we're specifying the scope as this specific process only. And so we do this because we don't want to change kind of the system-wide settings permanently. That's obviously going to kind of create more ripples, potential noise that'll get us caught. And so we're like keeping things confined to this session only. Right, typically no feedback is good. And so now the next thing we'll do is we'll actually just run our script. One tiny thing that's a little bit unusual here, you can see I'm not just invoking the script, but I'm actually adding this period right there, period space, and then I'm basically calling the script. So what is this? Well, this is called dot sourcing. And it's basically just a technique that we can use to run this script in the current scope instead of its own scope. So what that kind of like functionally means is when we dot source a script, we can now call any of the functions in that script as if it's just part of the native commands of this PowerShell shell. Right, so everything is set up, so we should be able to now just go ahead and run our Powerview commands. So today specifically, I'm going to run 5 commands. There are obviously many more, but I think these 5 only are good because without, wanting to inundate you with an avalanche of information, these 5 are going to show you kind of the core information we are typically interested in as it relates to Active Directory environments. And so the first command I'll run is get net domain controller. And we can see the output here. Now guys, I just want to find a little bit of balance. I don't see any point of just running these commands, dumping the results and moving on. At the same time, I don't want to deconstruct every single thing here because I'll lose you guys along the way too. So for each of these, I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on what I think are some of the more important things that we want to pay attention to, right? So here right at the top, we can see the actual forest to which the domain belongs. And a forest you can just think of as the topmost level of an organizational structure in Active Directory. Now right right now, it's not that interesting because the thing is that we have a very flat Active Directory. Because we're running all of this on our own system, we're kind of constrained. We can't generate, 500 different Active Directory VMs and create a whole complex system. So it's not that useful right now, but in an actual scenario where you do have a more tiered setup in Active Directory, this could be very useful for us to understand kind of like what's at the top of our Active Directory structure. Here we can see the specific Windows version of the system, and here we can also see the roles held by the domain controller. Finally, here we can see the domain and IP address. There's a few ways to get this information, but it's obviously core information that we're interested in. And then finally here, name is basically the FQDN, and there we can see the FQDN.
What the f?
Alright guys, so I'm actually just quickly showing you what's happening here. I just lost my session, and it's because that Windows just decided randomly right now to go ahead and update my system while I'm recording a video for you guys. I'll be back shortly, but let this be a warning. We should probably also get into the habit of completely disabling Windows Update in registry, because this is a pain in the ass. But anyway, I'll see you guys shortly.
A few moments later.
Alright friends, and we are so back. You can see here once again the command I just ran, and we just completed that. So let's continue on to our next command. So the next one we're going to run is incredibly useful in terms of understanding password and Kerberos policy. And we can see basically here, it gives us a lot of information related to the specifics of the password and Kerberos policy. And so this can obviously be very useful for us as we kind of plot or plan ways of doing various password attacks or Kerberos ticket attacks or things like that. So I'm not going to break all of this down specifically, but most of it's pretty logical. And if not, I recommend you just copy, paste, drop that in ChatGPT, ask it to break it down. And so for our next command, we want to basically look at all the other hosts on this very same domain. And that's with get netcomputer. So here it outputted quite a lot of information. Let's just have a quick look. And we can see here that even though we have our SEEK2 connection to station 1, it was able to identify the domain controller for us. And it also gets other useful information. For example, it gets the operating system and things like that. And if we scroll down a bit, we'll basically see the DNS, which, in case you didn't know, it's important to understand. In most situations, and if not always, the domain controller serves as the de facto DNS host for all stations on that domain. Finally, we can go down here and look at the station that we're connected to. We can also see its operating system. Now in this situation, these results weren't that spectacular because basically it revealed to us a system that we already knew exists, as well as, one additional system, which is the domain controller. But keep in mind again, guys, this is only a 2-system Active Directory domain. Obviously, in reality, we'd expect to see many more, right? And so given that, let's say there could be thousands of different hosts or systems on this domain, a next question that we might want to ask is we want to know basically the same information, which systems are on this domain, but at the same time, we actually just want to know which systems are logged on at the moment, which are the active systems. And so right now I'll run this. We're going to get pretty much the same results because again, there's only 2 systems on this domain and both are logged in at the moment. And so here are our results. We can see first off, it has this habit of creating these duplicates, so we actually have to kind of sift through that or take account for that. Again, the results here aren't that spectacular or remarkable just because of the nature of our current limited setup. But here is indeed a correct list of all the systems currently logged in, which are the domain controller and station 1. And I also just want to point out, pretty cool, is it also gave us the username Sarah Connor being logged in to station 1. Great, so that's it for Powerview, guys. Like I said before, there's much more we can do with this. But the point of this course isn't really for us to do an extensive encyclopedic reference of everything Powerview. I just wanted to give you kind of a high-level overview and a sense of how it works, how to do it, and some of the information we might derive from it. And so that being the case, I wanted to switch over and run a few of our living off the land commands, right? But right before we do that, I want to take the moment, like I promised you in the beginning, to just quickly explain the difference between this specialized script approach and the living off the lands approach, pros and cons, why we would prefer the one to the other. So let's quickly take an interlude and then we'll be back in just a jiffy with the rest of our course, where I'll be looking at the living off the lands approach. And just so that we're all on the same page, when it comes to the living off the land approach, what it basically means is we're going to use commands and processes that already exist on the target system to serve our goals. And so this is a co-opted approach, meaning these processes and commands don't exist for attackers. That's not why they were designed, but we can use them to serve our goals. I recently did a course with John Strand, and I really loved this idea that he shared. He said that computer security is really hard because on a pattern level, the difference between what a legitimate user does and what an attacker does is pretty small. And now obviously when we're taking a living off the lands approach, that difference is even smaller because we're even using the same commands and processes as a legitimate user does. And therefore it follows that this is even harder to detect. And so this is exactly why we would like to take this approach. It is a more stealthy approach. We typically won't get flagged by endpoint detection because all the commands we're running are expected to run on the target system. And as opposed to the specialized script approach, we don't need to touch the disk. And so overall, we're just much less noisy using this approach. The drawback, however, is it does limit our capabilities because obviously there's less information we can derive from the built-in commands than if we just allow ourselves to write any script to potentially find anything out, right? It's also perhaps slightly less efficient or more cumbersome because often with a specialized script, we can run it and it will find all the information that we want in one shot. Whereas with the built-in commands, we typically have to run a number of commands to able to kind of like piece together all the information we want. So in contrast, when we think about specialized scripts, these aren't co-opted, right? They were crafted with the express intent of serving some attacking or red teaming function. So as I just mentioned before, the advantage of using specialized script is it's more efficient in the sense that there's less commands we need to ultimately execute because we typically just run the script and then get the information we want. And at the same time, it has greater capabilities. For example, let's think about Bloodhound and the graphs it can give us. Obviously, there's no wmic command that's going to draw a beautiful graph of our Active Directory domain as we would find with Bloodhound. But this greater efficiency and capability comes at a pretty steep price. The first thing is we're running a script which in many ways is unusual. First of all, many of these popular scripts will already have signature detection tuned to look for their presence. But even without signature detection, just running a script that's not supposed to run can in and of itself, of course, trigger some alarm bells. And then the big problem here obviously is that the script isn't just pre-installed on the victim system waiting for us there. We need to upload it to disk. And so it's especially this step that carries a big risk. But if we kind of think of all the steps involved with running a specialized script, it just on a pattern level makes more noise than if we were just to use the built-in commands as we would with the living off the lands approach. Okay friends, so I just wanted to cover both of these two separate approaches in this video so you're aware both exists and you get a feeling for kind of what both entail. I think it's worth mentioning that as of late, the living off the land approach is quite a bit more popular, and I think in many ways that's just a direct consequence of us getting better at defending. Alright, so I think that's enough chit chat again. Let's jump right back into our tutorial where we'll now be doing the living off the lands approach. So the first thing we want to do is right now, we're still in our PowerShell shell. Man, that's hard to say. PowerShell shell. And we want to actually switch over to a command prompt. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control Z, and I'm basically going to background this channel. And we can see that we're back in Interpreter, and I'm just going to write shell. Let's see if we can actually clear. I'm not too sure we can. No, okay. So sorry guys, I would have loved for us to start up here on a fresh page. But these kind of derivative shells, sometimes they just don't act exactly as you like them to. So the first command we can run is something that's probably very familiar to all of you, because we use it all the time to basically check our own IP and gateway and stuff on our Windows system, which is ipconfig all, right? But here we can see a lot of useful information. So we can see our host name, we can see the DNS suffix here, and then quite importantly, we can see that DHCP is not enabled right now, and we can see the IP of our DNS server, which we can also infer in this case is of course the IP of our domain controller. And then finally we can see the IP address of our default gateway, all real important high-level information that starts to help us paint a clearer picture of the kind of network organizational structure on the target system. So I'm going to run the next command. I just want to be clear that we're actually going to just derive a lot of the information we did before with Powerview, because obviously this isn't supplementary or complementary. What I'm showing here is an alternative route. So I'm showing basically a more discrete manner to essentially get a lot of the same information that we could have gotten with Powerview, right? And so something that's incredibly popular for this living off the lands approach is of course wmic. And so we can run that and we can see the IP of the DC, which kind of confirms to us what we saw here. The DNS server we actually know is the DC, right? And it gives us the domain name, get good. Right, so the next thing we'll do is run another wmic command, and this will basically show us all the systems on the domain. And here we can see indeed, as we did before, the name of the system we're connected to, station 1, as well as the domain controller. And so just at the risk of starting to sound incredibly redundant, I'll just mention one more time that in an actual Active Directory setup, we'd expect there to be way more hosts. And this information obviously can be very useful for us. We can start identifying, potential targets for lateral movement. Obviously, some accounts might have different levels of access, different permissions, so we might want to laterally move to something that gets us one step closer to our ultimate goal. So right now, let's assume as an attacker, we're really interested in our domain controller DC01. And so perhaps we might want to run the following command that I guess we can pronounce Qwinsta or Quinsta.
I'm Ron Burgundy.
And what this is going to do is going to show us the username of the account on DC1. So there we see administrator. This could be useful for us. We can kind of look to see if there are any active sessions we can hijack, or we can identify the users that are currently logged in, which might help inform us who to target in a social engineering sense or in a phishing attack, etc. And then I have one more command I want to run, which is going to give us a lot of information about the group policy settings. But for this, we actually will generate an HTML file right here on the victim system, and then we're going to exfiltrate it back to our own system so we can view it. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and generate it on the desktop. Obviously, in reality, we want to be a little bit more stealthy. We want to be in a folder, let's say like temp or something else like that. Because let's say somebody's working at their station, looking at their desktop, and all of a sudden a new HTML file just pops up. Obviously, that would potentially alert people as to our presence. In any case, we're going to run gpresult/8 gpreport.html. And since we didn't receive any error, we can assume it worked. And now we want to exfiltrate or download this file back to our own system, but we're actually not going to do it here in command shell. We're going to do it back in our meterpreter shell. So I'm going to hit Control Z, going to background it. We're back in our meterpreter shell. And so I'll run the following command. And just take note there again, guys, of the double backslash. We run that. It says it was successful. Let's have a look. And so since it's an HTML file, I'm just gonna ahead and open it right here in our browser in Firefox. And here you can take a moment to look at your own results, and it will give us a whole lot of information related to our group policy. Right. Okay, friends, that's it. Please join me for part 2, in which we'll be doing host enumeration, because it'll obviously be awesome. But until then,
Peace out.